right, so for our psalm this morning, I'm reading from Psalm 119. 119 is the longest psalm with 176 verses.
Oh boy, you reading
Yeah.
all of them?
No.
I was gonna say, that will take us till 11:15.
Right. All right, so I'm reading verses 113 through 120. And I don't, this section sort of spoke to me because what we're going to be talking about today is why the Jews and the Christians in the early history of the church, why they separated. All right. So this one kind of hit me. All right. So Psalm 119, starting with 113. I hate a divided heart. I love your law. You are my refuge and shield. I put my hope in your word. Leave me alone, you wicked. I shall observe the commandments of my God. True to your word, support me, and I shall live. Do not disappoint me of my hope. Uphold me, and I shall be saved. My gaze fixed on your will. You shake off all who stray from your will. Deceit fills their horizon. In your sight, all the wicked of the earth are like rust. So I love your instructions. My whole body trembles before you. Your judgments fill me with fear. To me, that just kind of spoke to sort of the conflicts that developed and the perceptions, the different perceptions. So Evans in our book, he doesn't treat it as a chapter, he treats it as an appendix to talk about the root causes of the Jewish-Christian rift, is what he termed it. And he said that a lot of scholars term it a parting of the ways, but he felt that kind of neutral wording masked the bitterness that really developed over time. So there are lots of different factors. So I'm going to go through the different kind of factors he thinks fed into it, and then the big reason why he thinks, that the Jews and the Christians split so much. So to start off with, it talks about with Christianity pulling in Gentiles and pretty aggressively reaching out to Gentiles. All right. So, Paul had a lot to do with that, and other disciples did too. So, whereas the converts to Judaism, they had to follow all the laws, right? But the Gentiles coming into this body of faith, they didn't have to deal with all the stuff in the Torah necessarily. So you got a pretty wide range of perspectives there. Another big issue that really confronted, in the early church was the Jews had a hard time, some Christians too, accepting the divinity of Jesus, seeing Jesus as divine. The concept of the virgin birth was pretty common early on in the history of the church. And it was more the Greeks and the Roman converts who saw Jesus as a God, right? But then there were some Christians who saw Jesus as Israel's Messiah, saw him as fulfilling the scripture, but wouldn't say that he was divine. Right? And so there were those that thought if Jesus was God, was that defying the first commandment? That's how some folks saw it. So then there were the whole, the Jewish law issues as far as food purity, laws of purity. What day was the Sabbath? All right, that was, an issue. So, and then Gentile numbers were increasing, Jewish Christian numbers were decreasing. All right, over time, we're talking about after the destruction of the temple and all that. So that was going on. Then another big issue that sort of separated people was which version of the Hebrew Bible they were using, which version of the Torah. Because by this time, the Torah had been translated into Greek, and that's called the Septuagint. And so the Greek folks were using mostly the Septuagint, right? Whereas, the folks in Palestine are using either the Torah in Hebrew or in Aramaic. So you've got that whole issue too. Then there was the issue after, the destruction of the temple. And remember last week we talked about the second uprising against Rome, the Bar Kokhba, right? And that was in the 130s. So there was the whole issue of nationalism for Israel, right? With the country basically being destroyed. So that, for the folks that didn't live in Israel, well, it wasn't so much an issue for them, Then with the Bar Kokhba, all right, that guy, there were a good number of Jews that saw him as being the Messiah. That he was coming back. How is that? All right. So think about it for a minute. All right. What was sort of the popular expectation for what the Messiah was going to do?
Yeah, take over.
Take over. Right. Restore our country to be.
Yeah, but they've gone through all these other takeovers in history. That's why, what's one more?
Well, apparently this guy, the first name was Simon. And so there were a lot of folks that thought Simon was going to, after the temple had been destroyed. So here we are 60 years later, and he's like, yeah, I'm going to restore the country. So there were, and apparently a good number of folks that thought, hey, this guy's really the Messiah. He's going to be the king. He's going to become the king that we need to restore our country. Revenge. Well, that's that's the other part of.
Was he a military leader?
I don't know what it had necessarily been. I don't know if the Jewish people really had a military, but he was a leader. Became a leader.
Does the author say anything about the Jewish people at that time on where their belief in the true resurrection was or not? How do the Jews handle the resurrection? I mean, we're only talking 70 years, 2 generations, 3 generations, from 30 to 130, well, 100 years. But
yeah,
you would think that would have still been a little more important than a military ruler from a religious or faith standpoint to the Jews. How did they deal with it?
All right. First of all, let me say this: there was not a homogenous
No,
Jewish
I
perspective.
know.
Yeah.
It's like a soup where nobody, where all different facets.
Right, because there wasn't a handbook either.
Right.
It would say this exactly how.
Oh, you had the Torah. So
you had to say how you're supposed to be a Jew.
Right. Okay, but with the resurrection, where
Some yes.
the ones that did not become Christian?
All right, so the ones who did not become Christian, I don't know that he talked to.
Because I've read half the book and I haven't found anything in there about how the Jewish post-resurrection Jews viewed the resurrection.
What he makes more of a point about, and this is what he thinks is the big reason, all right, is because Jesus died,
Mm-hmm.
and he died in a way that was considered shameful in general society, all right, and the kingdom didn't happen. even though Jesus kept talking about God's kingdom, the kingdom, and I use quotes,
Right.
didn't happen the way they expected it to.
Okay. Oh, and there was no real overt deniability of the resurrection then. That's what
Not that I read.
I would suspect that there would be though.
I
I
would
would
think there
suspect
would
that
be,
there-
but nothing that's in the book
Right,
that,
since I wasn't, it was like even Thomas was doubting,
right,
until he saw.
Right.
right.
So what about the people who didn't see?
Well, thousands did, so, I mean, at some point, so. But anyway, I was just curious, because nothing was mentioned on that in the book.
Right. I mean, so I mentioned there were some that were like, this is kind of weird. But
Well, up until 70, the Sanhedrin would have been preaching against that it ever happened.
right, the Jewish leadership, much of it, not necessarily all of it, but a good portion of the Jewish leadership did not agree, did not support Jesus, obviously, from the Passion story. But yeah, but the Sanhedrin no longer existed after.
Well, up until 70.
Right. That's what I was saying.
Right.
After the temple was destroyed.
Right.
Well, that's why I was, how they pass it, what was passed on generation from 70 to 130. That was the part leading up to the Baraka or whatever his name is.
Bar Kakba.
Bar Kakba.
Bar Kakba.
Anyway,
Kakba.
so,
Well, and there are, I read a little bit of them last week. He does have in here some quotes written by ancient Jewish authors from this time period.
they must be towards the end.
Yeah, they're in this last chapter. He's got the page. All right. All right, so this one guy, because he doesn't say who wrote these, but they're from ancient manuscripts. All right, one guy wrote, Jesus had 5 disciples, Mathai, Nakai, Nazer, Bunai, and Toda. And then there was another statement, Jesus practiced magic and led Israel astray.
Okay.
That's
I mean,
that's one. That's one.
Okay.
All right.
Weird but fair.
Yeah.
On the teachings of Jesus, he, a judge, said to them, I looked at the end of the book in which it is written, I am not come to take away the law of Moses, and I am not come to add to the law of Moses, which is a reference to Matthew 5:17. And it is written, where there is a son, a daughter does not inherit. She said to him, let your light shine forth as a lamp, which is Matthew 5:16. But this guy named Gamaliel said to her, the ass came and kicked the lamp over.
Wonder what his name was.
All right, so on the crucifixion of Jesus, one ancient Jewish writer wrote, on the eve of Passover, they hanged Jesus the Nazarene. And a herald went out in front of him for 40 days, saying, he is going to be stoned because he practiced sorcery and enticed and led Israel astray. Let anyone who knows anything in his favor come and plead on his behalf. But not having found anything in his favor, they hanged him on the eve of Passover, which is some difference. On the resurrection of Jesus, another writer wrote, he then went and raised Jesus by incantation.
Who did?
Wow.
I don't know.
Who did?
I don't know, because he just has these ancient Jewish
Right.
writers on Jesus. That's
Okay.
all he has here.
Okay.
On healing in the name of Jesus. It once happened that Ben Dama, the son of Ar Ishmael's sister, was bitten by a serpent, and Jacob, a native of Kafar Sekaniah, came to him in the name of Jesus ben Patera, but Ar Ishmael would not permit him.
I don't understand
I don't either.
that. It's like,
So it sounds like Jesus came
They
Some
wouldn't let
guy,
him-
somebody came in the name of Jesus to heal the kid that had been bitten by the
They
serpent,
wouldn't let him do it.
but, yeah, but his uncle wouldn't let him in.
Revisionism history was back then too. As it is today.
Yeah,
I've never heard of any of those people.
No,
right, right. So there were lots, another
Okay.
issue was the whole debate about, do we rebuild the temple? All right, because on that, Gentile Christians and Jewish Christians were divided. Gentile Christians thinking, no, this isn't necessary. The Jewish Christians, yes.
No.
No.
okay, thank you.
So, so as far as getting back to what Evans thinks the biggest issue was, that the kingdom, because there were a lot of folks that hoped that it would be a military takeover to force Rome out. And of course that didn't happen. And there were, we know from Matthew, and we talked about it a couple weeks ago with John, there were several, Paul too, Paul spoke to the Gentiles, but he also spoke to the Jews. And how it almost seemed like, now in retrospect, as I look at all these factors and all this, it was a mighty big task to try to maintain. And I think there are still, it's an issue that we still struggle with, looking at Christianity, because there are still Hebrew Christians. I can remember there were a couple of families when I was working in Louisa, that I think they called themselves Hebrew Christians. They didn't celebrate Christmas and Easter. They celebrated the Jewish holidays. And they believed that Jesus was God's son and was the Messiah.
Oh.
So Seventh-day Adventists ascribe to a good portion of their worship is on Saturday. That's why they're Seventh-day Adventists.
Yeah.
They don't eat pork. A lot of them are vegetarians.
You don't use hospitals.
That's Jehovah's Witnesses.
That's also, one of the other ones, Jamie's brother, or our brother-in-law was one, he didn't go to doctors, but he wasn't Seventh-day Adventist, I don't think, he was,
Church of, wait a minute.
I can't think what he was.
Yeah, it's
But he was-
Christian Scientist.
That's it, yeah,
Oh,
Yeah,
Yeah,
Christian
yeah.
Scientist.
yeah.
Right.
Jehovah's Witnesses won't take blood or blood
Right.
products, but they will go to the hospital because I've had a patient that was a kidney transplant. But they would not take a.
So
blood
what you were
transfusion.
saying, well, go to the hospital's Christian Scientist.
I had
Yeah.
a real personal experience with that. As a kid, stupidly, I don't know who's doing what, but this boy had his sister hold a walnut and he chopped it with an axe and he cut her
Oh,
thumb almost
Good
off.
grief.
She was bleeding to death, really.
And
And
he wouldn't.
the mother came and said, if it's God's will, she'll die.
Oh, wow.
And that pretty well put a wrench in my.
And what were they Christians on?
Yeah, there are some Christian Scientists that will
Crazy.
use some medical
The
practices.
father.
Like the
came and
celebrities
finally
probably use
landed
medical
and took us to the
practices.
hospital.
Right? That are
My
Christians.
brother-in-law wouldn't go to the
Yeah.
doctor, nothing,
Yeah.
he had a
Right.
cyst develop on his cheek, and it took about 5 years for it to finally go away. But for 4 or 5 years, and he's a professional, he was a big shot in a company, and it looked like he had a chaw,
Ew.
okay? And it took about 4 or 5 years for that thing to finally go away, and he wasn't gonna get treated, nothing. So,
Was it cancerous?
no, apparently not. So, but, anyway,
No.
so he found a way, he died of a heart attack. So,
Well, there were,
Something non-related.
yeah, totally unrelated to that. So, anyway,
we were told that there are 987 churches in Rome.
Yeah.
And the majority, many of those were temples. Okay,
Oh, started out as temple.
started out as
Pagan
temples,
temples.
pagan temples. The only reason this one temple, the church we were in front of, the guide said the only reason that church is standing today, guess why? And it's because there's a cross on top of it, that they had transformed it to a Christian
Oh, wow.
church, and therefore it was saved. It wasn't mutilated. So talk about the kingdom. You know, you take a look at Rome now compared with what it was when it was pagan. You know, I mean, all of the churches there that exist
Hmm.
that are
So
only
it's a
existing
different,
because it was
different
it was
way.
it was a different way for, but right now Rome is the Pope. Rome is.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Well,
Christian.
you were there when he was selected, right?
Yes,
Right,
yeah.
What was decided, an aside, what was the thinking locally that an American was named
They
the
were
Pope?
congratulating.
They were
They were?
congratulating. They were very happy.
Okay,
And this is the year of the Jubilee, so there's a special door that they only open every 25 years.
Wow.
We got to walk through the door, which didn't mean anything to me really, but for Catholics, it was very important.
great.
I, studied our history a good bit. We went into the Vatican and all this stuff. I see all this artwork, and I walked away feeling like all of these images that we see, these Christian images. I think if I went back analyzing, what does this painting mean? Who is this figure? Whatever. The first question I would ask is, who commissioned it and what was their political agenda? And that's what I came away with, is a whole heavy
Very
part full of
political.
politics.
Political.
Well, some of that goes all the way back to the Holy Roman Empire, which was, that's a,
Exactly.
basically, Europe was a theocracy.
Well, that's what I'm talking about, and it's just
And,
different
and then it
people.
developed pretty quickly,
Yeah.
in the history of the church. Yeah. I do want to throw out, there have been a couple of segments of Jewish Christians that continued on for hundreds of years. One was the Nazarenes. And there's a reference to the Nazarene, I think, in Acts. But so I went yesterday getting ready. It was like going down one rabbit hole and then another rabbit hole and another rabbit hole. So there was one group of Jewish Christians called the Ebionites, Ebionite, and they were ones that struggled with whether Jesus was divine. They believed in the resurrection stuff, but was he really divine? But they lived pretty much by a vow of poverty, and but were around for a while, for a few hundred years, and the Nazarenes continued up through at least the 1000s.
There's a Church of the Nazarene on Courthouse Road.
Yeah, and that's another
Southside.
denomination.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
now the Church of the, and I don't know much about it. Yeah, now that
It's
you say
huge.
that, it didn't.
It's
Yeah.
huge.
No, I follow one. There are some liberal Nazarenes.
What are they? What's their faith
And there was
like? I mean, do they like
my verse?
Baptist or?
Never met one.
I know.
no, there was a Nazarene
But I
church in
know.
Louisa. I know I talked with folks up here once, but let's see, Church
Carol,
of
do
the
you know
Nazarene.
anything about that?
The Church of the Nazarene.
No, I don't. No.
But it's a big church for sure. It's out
Yeah,
on the courthouse.
yeah, no, they're a denomination. Nazarene.org. As a discipleship is a journey of grace with Jesus as our guide and companion. As a global community of faith, we are commissioned to take the good news of life in Jesus Christ to people everywhere and to spread the message of scriptural holiness across the land.
Like missionary.
Oh, they're of the Wesleyan holiness tradition. So They go back to some similar roots as the Methodists.
That's what I was gonna say, Methodist.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
They're the largest denomination in the classical Wesleyan holiness tradition.
Okay.
The doctrine that distinguishes the Church of the Nazarene and other Wesleyan denominations from most other Christian denominations is that of entire sanctification. Okay? Nazarenes believe that God calls Christians to a life of holy living that is marked by an act of God, cleansing the heart from original sin and fulfilling the individual with love for God and humankind.
How is that different? What we,
I don't know, I'm trying to figure that
Yeah,
out.
sounds similar, but then it might be a different form of baptism. That also sounds
Yeah.
very similar to Anglican or Catholic to some degree. So the original sin part.
Right.
Okay, so that implies some sort of maybe infant baptism, or I mean that's just what I read out of it, because we don't talk about original sin here, but they do in a Catholic or in an
Yeah.
Anglican church.
Episcopal, yeah.
Yeah. So
High
Well, it's the
Episcopal, I
plot for
get-
the entire Old Testament and New Testament.
it's what,
It's the plot.
and yeah, but that's what sounds like a spinoff Methodist, possibly Lutheran even. So they have that kind of thing too. So
Right, so as I mean, they've got.
see if they splash or dunk.
Yeah.
That's what I call it.
I've
Splash.
gotten all of them.
Same here. I've
I mean-
been splashed in, dunked.
Splash, dunked, and
if you're a witch, it's still.
as we went through that.
Baptism.
Yeah, the person there's the most involved, they swim. Oh,
Yes,
shoot.
I've gone through the ages of
Oh, yeah, you
denomination.
can be
right?
baptized by sprinkling, pouring, or immersion.
Oh,
Okay, at what age? Do they have an age minimum?
It is to be administered to believers, indicating their full purpose of obedience and holiness and righteousness.
Okay,
As participants in
again,
the new
now it's like
covenant,
us.
young children and
Yeah.
morally innocent
like,
may be baptized upon request of parents or guardians.
it's like a dedication,
Uh,
like we,
Oh, you say they can be baptized on the request of parents or guardians?
Right, but they see
Well,
it
that's
as
also
a
baby then.
sacrament.
yeah,
Yeah, they see it as-
dedication and all that.
Okay, so they're calling it a sacrament, like yeah, Catholics and Episcopalians.
Right, and the Lord's
Dedicating
Supper.
the baby and all that,
Yeah.
yeah.
So you can splash or dunk.
Or sprinkle.
Or sprinkle.
Yeah, I'm getting to the point where I need to swim.
Yeah,
Oh,
cool.
goodness. All right. Well, I did want to kind of see, hear
Sorry
back
about
from
that.
you guys as far as this whole study of the early church, kind of what you're taking out of it, what you've gotten out of it.
I've enjoyed it.
Mhm. Good history lesson for me.
I sure enjoyed it more than a misguided Jew trying to tell us about Christianity.
And that's the last
Harold.
book.
You asked what we thought.
Well,
I just hope there's not a test.
Yeah, I was like,
I'm never given a test.
I'd lose it on the names.
or spellings,
Yeah,
pronunciation.
I'm still trying to remember Akbar or whoever that
Oh,
guy.
fuck.
The things you went over today or talked about was.
It makes you want to study deeper.
the
Yes, it does.
tradition of
You know,
Jews.
yeah.
Susan, you're right.
Jews
Yeah.
who believed in the resurrection or didn't believe in it, and some who had to follow the traditional Jewish laws and some who didn't. And it reminds me in a way of the split from Catholicism to Martin Luther King, it's another split.
Martin
Luther.
Yeah.
What did I say?
Martin Luther King.
Yeah, he became king. In his own. No.
Still running on Italy time, I think.
Yeah, did it? Guess what really strikes it, and I know that I'm gonna say something here that not everybody's gonna agree with, and I'm okay with that. I'm gonna say that this is.
I don't agree.
I don't
I
either.
don't agree.
I'm with you, Harold.
That the church is a human institution that I hope is divinely inspired and divinely guided. But the participants in the church have to decide how they're gonna
How they're
when we
gonna be.
when we visited the chapel where Saint Francis is buried,
Uh-huh.
the
Oh, wow.
Francesco was one of the one of the assistants with the tour group, the Miata Drive tour group, and he was a blast. And Francesco went into that cathedral with us, and he said, "I just wonder what Saint Francis would think with all of this decoration." And
Well, he went to that chapel often to pray himself.
but no, this was this was a big, gaudy, the gaudiest church I've ever been in my life,
Wow.
and with all of the decoration and everything. And he says, Saint Francis, and they were all agreeing, Saint Francis was simplicity,
Saint
and
Francis or Pope Francis?
Saint
Saint.
Saint
Francis.
Francis. Oh, so that what Saint Francis
Saint
would think
Francis,
about
Saint
this.
Francis, okay,
Right.
and that he's buried in the bottom of the church, and we went down
Wow.
to where his crypt is. And it was, thank God, it was plain.
Oh.
It didn't have all of that
Right.
decoration and whatever.
Ornateness to
Oh.
the top.
And it was, just a statement there. But above,
That-
he
that
would have
is a
probably
consistency.
rolled over in his crypt,
Well, he
to see.
chose.
you know.
You're talking about Pope Francis.
No, I'm talking
Yeah,
about
Saint-
Saint Francis.
Oh,
Pope
Francis.
Francis did
Oh,
too.
oh, oh.
He
Saint
was very
Francis,
plain.
Francis of Assisi.
Right.
Okay.
Oh, okay. So you went to where Saint
Yes,
Francis, not
yes.
Pope Francis.
No, not Pope Francis.
Okay,
But he
gotcha.
chose a regular
Very
coffin.
simple
Yeah, very
life.
with like.
Oh, yeah.
wasn't
Very.
nothing
And then
on
they
it.
built this, it's like, they always talk about that Rome is lasagna, it's layers upon layers upon layers. You have, the pagan church built up on top of the pagan church, but in the Sistine Chapel or in St. Paul's Basilica, St. Paul is buried, and there are 3 or 4 levels of churches built, but the
Oh.
altar is always right above his tomb.
Wow.
Okay, the altar always stands
On all
right
of
above.
those.
Right.
And in Assisi, aside from what the church has formally done, all the commercialization, tourist stuff that's associated with it, so you can buy a monk's tunic. to
It goes
go
over your beer.
wine
Yeah,
bottle.
Right
Goes over
across the
your
street,
wine
probably
bottle.
from the church.
God.
And a little
Weird.
vendor,
Oh my
vendors,
God, here you go.
yeah, vendor's kiosk right across the street from the
Gosh.
church.
Oh my
So,
goodness.
Well, all these variations and plots Jesus said, I will only go to those that God has selected. I mean, I don't think, based on the scriptures, not everybody is going to be, come to know Jesus the way I think we do. And that's just part of the plan. Now, it doesn't, and I'm not saying the rest will go to hell because it doesn't say that in the scriptures. But, we have so many different variations, and not, it's all of it can't be dead nuts. But I don't think Christ ever said it would be.
No, he didn't say it would never be easy. I think we're always gonna have, I think we always have, and we always will have differing views and interpretations of what God wants us to do. As I was reading stuff for this today, one thing that I'm really grateful is that I, at this church and in other churches, I have never experienced, the minister or any other leader of the church speaking in public against Jews or against Judaism. But I know that's happened in a lot of churches.
Most of the different churches over the years that we've been to, whether it's regardless of denomination, that are Christian, but they're all Christian related. I've never heard anybody say anything really negative against the Jews. It was more our way, Christian way is the right way, the way it's supposed to be. It's more that kind of affirmation as opposed to
An
an
insinuation.
insinuation or
Yeah.
degradation.
Right.
Okay, so that's the way I've never heard it. Any preacher, and we've been to some zany ones
Oh, yeah.
Okay, the ones that speak in tongues, that's different.
That's
But
way out
I've
there.
never, but I've never heard a minister, from the pulpit in any of the sermons, say anything negative
Mm-mm, I haven't
about
either.
Jews. So,
Mm.
Good.
and,
Yeah, I mean,
I've got I've had over the years a number of Jewish friends, and they really, they don't, they study their faith so much deeper than what Christians study ours. They
Yes.
really do.
They,
Okay, and so their affirmations for their faith are in some ways stronger than a Christian
Because
trying
all
to.
their young people
Well,
go through.
I think
everything.
I think that varies in the Jewish community as much as in the Christian community, though, because I've got some Jewish friends and they were clients to begin with and became friends. They believed in giving to the synagogue, but I don't think they ever went across the door. They were not that devoted, or and yet it was they did believe in giving to the synagogue, but it was like at that point their obligation was over with those people. I'm saying. So
Well,
I'm
you have
a
that.
Christian.
You
They
have
feel
that.
the same
Yeah.
thing.
I mean, there are a lot of Christians in name only.
That's right.
Yes.
Yeah.
no, absolutely. I mean, C.S. Lewis said, the word Christian has been so overused it has no meaning. And that was, in 45.
The Catholics lead the way in that, by the way.
Confession for-
The
You have
Catholics
to
lead the
talk with
way.
Joe-
Easter
Joe
and Christmas, that's it.
Bancroft.
They go to
Because
confession and
he went to
say,
a
I've been
church,
here for a
and
month
he-
and
I think he
No,
and Barbara
I'm good now.
Most Catholics don't go to
because they
confession
were
but once a year,
saying things
right
against
before Easter or right before Christmas.
Yeah, the
Political-
anti-Semitic.
So if they still do.
not
I
They
don't
don't know if
A lot
you do
of
or not. They don't,
against
they
him.
don't have it anymore.
Against Joe?
So,
Yes, for his political beliefs.
Oh,
Okay, so Joe Bancroft
in recent times or?
what?
said when they went to Georgia,
Oh, okay. Yeah.
that there was a church that I think they were walking out. I don't know if they walked out. You know more about it than I do,
Well,
but.
Yeah, so I may be stepping on ice to say this, but, there is a real issue with what's called Christian nationalism.
Yes.
And it's where there are bodies of Christians who have become very political, to the point of, even saying to the ministers that, Jesus' teachings like in the Sermon on the Mount, that's just not right. So, and I didn't really give it much credence. I'd heard a little bit about this until I went to General Assembly a couple of years ago. And there was, in business meeting, there was a resolution about Christian nationalism and the denomination, being aware of it and being cognizant of it and trying to address it. And I didn't give it much I was like, oh, okay. But then the military chaplains started speaking in favor of this resolution
Really?
and talking about what an issue it is.
Which resolution?
It was a resolution about Christian nationalism and about how the denominations take a stand against it and to work against it.
What do they advocate that you want to work against? I'm curious.
I don't, this is the first time I've heard of something like this.
Okay.
Okay, because I always looked at it the other way around. Growing up in Pennsylvania, in the '70s, the Berrien brothers were two priests who were they're way out there on their liberal side of life. So
Yeah.
I've always
Well-
and you just say, okay, that's their view. But I mean, so that's why I said I haven't heard about Christian nationalism. I've heard a lot of things about conservative Christians. Of course,
Yeah.
Well,
right
and
wing and everything.
when
But
we
Right.
were,
Now this is beyond that.
okay, that
Well, what do they advocate?
yeah.
I don't know.
So what they seem to advocate, and this is just my perspective of what I've heard and seen folks talk about, is advocating almost like a militaristic type of thinking to be sure that things go politically the way you want it to go through, as opposed to.
Earlier, someone asked, I think you asked Bernie, what did the Italians think of an American Pope?
Yeah.
And they were everyone that we spoke with was very positive toward
Mhm.
that. The only negative thing that I heard while I was over there about an American Pope came from America, that he
Okay.
was not American enough.
Oh, because yeah.
He's
Peru
he's about in the world
Right.
and he's not American enough.
Oh,
Okay.
wow.
Okay, and that's what I think when you're
Yeah,
talking
that's
about,
that's a one type of thinking.
right,
And then they get into the president election and all that stuff, right? And, okay.
Right.
Well, people that do that on Facebook all the time, they,
Right,
Bring
right,
up
but
their-
it's, using the church.
yeah,
To do
Right,
that, and
right.
that this is the only right way, and.
yeah.
Well, it's anything you tack for Jesus onto the end of it, like Club a Baby Seal for Jesus. Sounds a lot better. Okay? So anything can be twisted and
and it usually is.
yes, yes. And I'm not really sure, I thought about it, I'm like, gee, what political party did Jesus belong to? Wrong.
And he didn't, he said, give unto Caesar what is Caesar.
Right. But people tack anything. You can tack politics onto Jesus. No, you
Yeah.
can't. You
Right.
can't. You can't tack Club of Baby Seal for Jesus. You can't tack that on there and all of a sudden make it okay.
Right,
They have nothing
Nobody
to do with
can.
each other. No, they have nothing to do with
Nobody
each
can.
other.
right.
So
Yeah, in my mind, it's not right for anybody to do that.
I mean, I think a person's political beliefs are one thing, their religious beliefs are another.
Church and separation, church and state.
Yeah.
Right.
And does anybody know where that came from?
What, separation of church and state?
Yes.
Virginia?
No,
Was it
well,
Thomas
That was
Jefferson?
Magna Carta, wasn't it?
it was a letter to Thomas Jefferson. It's not in
Oh.
the Constitution. It's a made up kind of theorem that we've,
I thought it went back
Adopted
to
and-
England. 1066.
right now now if you hear people will, everything is a constitutional right, whether it has anything to do with the Constitution or not. But then again, you got to read that once in a while to know that.
Well, however it came, it developed to be part of the Constitution, didn't it, or the Bill of Rights?
No, it's not. No,
They said that you cannot, the country will not establish a religion. It's an anti-establishment, not a separation.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Well, it is 7 minutes till, so,
Right.
have a great summer. And if you have ideas for things for us to do next year, let Susan or Angie or Sarah or I let us know.